Hi, this is Susan Swain. I'm the host of C-SPAN's Q&A podcast. We're taking a few weeks break as the summer winds down and want to use this feed to introduce you to some of C-SPAN's other interesting nonfiction podcasts. Afterwards brings together best-selling nonfiction authors and influential interviewers for wide-ranging hour-long conversations. In this episode, Georgia Democrat Senator Raphael Warnock discusses his book, A Way Out of No Way. He's interviewed by Congressman James Clyburn of South Carolina, the Democratic whip of the House of Representatives. Q&A will be back with new episodes on September 11th.
Well, thank you very much for being here with me today and allowing me to talk to you a little bit about your great book that I guess was released on yesterday.
Yeah.
I understand it. And I'm particularly interested in this book, more so because of its title, A Way Out of No Way.
Yeah.
Now, having been born and raised in the parsonage, as you, I don't know if you were in the parsonage, but I'm the son of a fundamentalist minister, and you
PKs.
also. So we kind of know a little bit about what that means. How about tell me a little bit about why you picked this to be the title of your book?
Great. Well, thank you so much, and it's wonderful to be here with you. As you point out, both of us are what they call PKs, preacher's kids.
Absolutely.
And the title of my memoir, A Way Out of No Way, is a phrase that's deep in the culture of the black church. And let me hasten to say that when we say the black church, as you know, we have never meant anything racially exclusive about that.
Right.
We're talking about the anti-slavery church.
Absolutely.
We're talking about the church that was literally born fighting for freedom and bearing witness to our common humanity. You're not in a black church. You're not in the churches that raised and shaped me and you for long without hearing somebody in the midst of the service, maybe the preacher, maybe somebody in the choir, maybe a testimony, saying, you know, God makes a way out of no way.
Yeah.
And it is a phrase born of suffering and oppression and of keeping the faith, even when it seems like the odds are overwhelming, of hoping against hope, putting one foot in front of the other and moving forward, walking through the darkness, knowing that the light shines in the darkness and the darkness overcometh it not. And so the memoir reflects on the culture that has shaped me, but it's my story as an expression of the larger American story.
Well, that's great. And that reminds me a little bit of the choice I made for my memoirs that was published 7 years ago. And I called it Blessed Experiences. And it comes from my dad' favorite hymn, Blessed Assurance.
Yeah.
And as you just said, this is my story, this is my song.
Right.
Singing his praises all the day long. That reminds me a little bit of what I read in your book. You seem to be saying in this book that you feel that you were kind of preordained for the ministry and the pastorate. You made some choices about where to go to school based upon that preordination.
Yeah.
Share that with us.
Yeah, it was pretty evident to me early on that I was headed into ministry. And although my dad, bless his memory, was a pastor, and my mom later went into ministry, there was no pressure from them for me to go into ministry. I've come from a large family. I'm one of 12 children in my family. I'm number 11, first college graduate. But early on, I was captivated by this idea of going into ministry. As I point out in the book, A Way Out of No Way, in some ways it started out in terms of my preaching. The first time I stood in a pulpit to preach, it was on a youth Sunday. I grew up in a small church where they allowed the young people really to discover their voice.
Sure.
And one Sunday night, I have 6 older brothers, but the one just above me delivered the message that Sunday on Youth Sunday. And so I sat there listening to him. I said, shucks, I can do that.
and maybe a little better.
So the next month, when it was time for Youth Sunday to roll around, I made it clear that I wanted to deliver the sermon.
That's
and
great.
So on a Sunday night, a couple of months shy of my 12th birthday, was the first time I stood in a pulpit trying to express my faith. And as I went along, my parents were great examples for me, but there was another voice that was formative for me, and that is the voice of Martin Luther King Jr., who absolutely captured my imagination. I was born a year after Dr. King's death, but I was part of a generation of young people whose parents were fighting for his birthday to become a holiday. I'm sure you will remember that struggle. Sure. And even before it became a holiday, my parents and many other parents across our city and across the country pulled their kids out of school on the birthday. And I remember sitting at the May Street YMCA all day, listening to Dr. King's speeches, watching Eyes on the Prize, and his voice and the way in which his faith came alive in practical ways so that people had the courage to stand up for themselves. It captured my imagination. I went to Morehouse College largely because that was the school Dr. King attended.
Well, that's kind of interesting because Dr. King had a profound impact upon me as well.
Yeah.
Now, I was a 19-year-old college student.
Yeah.
When I first met Dr. King. I met him in John Lewis the same weekend, back in 1960, on the campus of Morehouse College. And, of course, as happens in movements like that, there's always some generational approaches that may not be the same. And there was a little disagreement that had cropped up among us students and, of course, SCLC. And we asked Dr. King to meet with us on that campus. He came to meet with us and agreed that we would get together at 10 o'clock in the evening for about an hour.
Were these the SNCC students?
Absolutely. I and John Lewis were founding members of SNCC.
Yeah.
So that meeting, the 10 o'clock meeting for 1 hour, we walked out of there at 4 a.m. the next morning. And I called it my Saul to Paul transformation. Yeah. And so I know it had to be a tremendous impact for you to grow up and go to the same school.
Yeah, yeah.
And then end up standing in his pulpit.
Yeah, I just wanted to attend the school that Martin Luther King Jr. attended. And I had no idea that I would later become the pastor of the church and stand in the pulpit where he served alongside his dad from 1960 to 1968. While I was a student at Morehouse College, and I talk about this in the book also, we had an event on campus, and I was president of the students who work in the chapel assistants they were called, at the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel on the campus of Morehouse College. We invited some of the public officials in the community to come to this event. The only one who showed up was your friend John Lewis. John Lewis was probably in his first or second term in the Congress, and that's when I met him. Honestly, I don't remember what he said that night. He gave a speech at our event. It was a long time ago. But it was the ministry of his presence alone. The fact that he took the time to come spend time with us students. He spoke at our event, and then afterwards I remember him standing around and spending some time with us. I had no idea that later on I would become his pastor as I assumed the pastorate of Ebenezer Baptist Church. And it is his kind of courage, the courage of a John Lewis and Amelia Boynton.
Oh yeah,
one of the women. We don't lift up those names nearly enough, but Amelia Boynton was gassed on that same bridge. I later met her. Hosea Williams, of course, crossed that bridge with John Lewis. It is the faith of people like that who really didn't have any reason to believe that they could win.
Absolutely.
Your generation, there was no. We look back at the civil rights movement, I think, and too often speak about these victories, the passage of the civil rights movement, the voting rights law, fair housing, as if these were inevitable victories. They were improbable, quite improbable.
Not just improbable, but one of the things I think is important that you point that out is that for people to understand, it didn't all happen in one fell swoop.
Right.
When I think about the work trying to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, and it, as the year said, it passed in 1964.
Right.
But when it passed, it didn't have voting in it, didn't have housing in it.
Right.
And really the part dealing with employment discrimination only applied to the private sector. Didn't even apply to the public sector. And so when you look back on that, you got the Civil Rights Act in 64, Voting Rights Act in 65, Fair Housing Law in 68, and it did not apply to the public sector until 72. So over an 8-year period, all of this took place, and people look back on it as if it all happened in one fell swoop. Right. And so when I look at your book and think about your journey, that incremental, these incremental steps.
Yeah. Sounds like you all didn't allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good.
That's exactly right.
And you kept moving with the recognition that the American story is such that there are moments when the democracy expands and we broaden our view of what it means to be one nation under God, or e pluribus unum, out of many one. And then there are moments when it contracts.
Absolutely.
But, you know, maybe it's the preacher in me who remembers that even contractions are necessary for new birth and new possibility. And so you keep moving and you keep bending that arc through fits and starts. And I'm a product of the work that you all did. You know, I'm a Head Start alum.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
Which, you know, that
I did not know that.
So I'm part. Me and Ben Ray Lujan are the two members of what we call the Head Start Caucus of the United States Senate.
Well, that's great. That's great. You know, and I'm glad you pointed that out, because, you know, when you go back, and a lot of things did not happen back then, but, you know, when Lyndon Johnson came with his so-called Great Society program,
yeah,
and I don't have to tell you, you are native of Georgia, sure, me of South Carolina. We know the history of those states, and the fact is that a lot of people talk about, even today, that Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs failed. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Great Society did not fail. Yeah. And you just mentioned Head Start.
Yeah.
That was a Great Society program.
Yeah.
And it's still going on today.
Yeah.
You and another United States Senator, graduates of that, the new president of South Carolina State, was Head Start's poster child on this 50th anniversary.
Right.
And now he's president of South Carolina State University. Right. Head Start did not fail.
Right. And for folks who may not know, we should point out that Head Start is a program that ensures that poor children have access to learning and literacy in those critical years, you know, when you're 3 and 4 years old, when the brain is literally growing and the neurons are firing, and if you don't engage parts of the brain during that time, the science says that it atrophies. Like, it's really part of how you change the world is you invest in young people, but particularly the very, very young. And so along with my parents, it exposed me to reading and a love for learning. And I like to say to folks all the time when I'm giving speeches, particularly at an audience where there are all of these sophisticated folks who are there, people who have degrees and credentials and position, you know, I hate to share it with you, but as smart as you are, you'll never be as smart as you were when you were 4 years old. That's where the real magic and power can happen. Not that it can't happen in other places, but that's an important place to invest. I'm a Head Start alum. And then in high school, I had a high school principal who invited me to become a part of a program called Upward Bound, which is part of a federal trio programs. It put a poor kid who grew up in public housing on a college campus. And if you can put a kid on a college campus, he or she can imagine themselves there. I spent my summers engaged in academic enrichment and my Saturdays on the campus of Savannah State University. And then when it came time to go to college, we didn't have the money. I often say I went to Morehouse on a full faith scholarship, which means I didn't have enough money for the first semester. But the other part of that story is Pell Grants, low-interest student loans. So I sit today in the United States Senate as a senator who knows the difference that good federal public policy can make.
You know, you and I have talked about the similarities in our backgrounds, both PKs, both going to what we call HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities. What I did not know is that that TRIO program you just mentioned, Upward Bound, was number one talent search. Number two,
Ron McNair.
Special Students Concerned program.
Yep.
Ron McNair was a talent search student.
Right.
I ran the talent search program in South Carolina.
Really?
Absolutely.
Wow.
One of them.
I did not know that.
I didn't know that you were part of the TRIO program.
Yep.
But there's a pretty big TRIO caucus in the Congress as well.
Right.
Especially on the House side.
Right.
A lot of my colleagues were in one of the TRIO programs, Upward Bound, Special Student Concerns. Right. That's amazing. But it's a testimony to why you are who and what you are. You know the benefit of these kinds of efforts, and that's why you've been so engaged in programs like what can we do about student loan debt, what we can do. For instance, I'm particularly interested in your work on the Senate side because I'm doing a little bit on the House side on putting a ceiling on the cost of insulin.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
What that means and what the federal government ought to be doing with that. Tell us a little bit about your priorities in the Senate.
Well, you know, I've been focused on the work, particularly around health care, long before I even decided I would run for office. My track has been ministry, and my decision to run for the Senate and serve in the Senate is an extension of that work. So I've been fighting for health care for years. And right now I have a bill on the Senate side which would cap the cost of insulin to $35 of out-of-pocket expenses per person.
But I want to remind our viewers here today that you're working on getting that passed in the Senate.
Oh, absolutely.
We've already passed it in the House. I'm just saying.
Fair point. And I'm doing everything I can to make sure we do our part.
That's great.
Let's try to get this done. In Georgia, 1 in 12 people in Georgia is a diabetic. 1 in 12. And in our country, $1 in $4 spent in our healthcare system is on people with diabetes. So part of the power, I think, of this focus on insulin, which, by the way, is a 100-year-old drug that they're price gouging.
Absolutely.
Right? But if you think about $1 in $4 in our healthcare system being spent on someone with diabetes, and you think about the cascading impact of diabetes when it's not managed or the things that can happen, dialysis, kidney failure, needing to go on dialysis, amputations. A doctor shared with me that the number one cause of blindness is diabetes.
Yep.
So it makes sense for the people that we're trying to help, but it makes sense for our overall health ecosystem.
One reason I want to get there before dealing with your ministry, I came along thinking I was going to follow my father into the ministry, and we talked about it a lot. And I was going to go to South Carolina State for 4 years, and then I was going on down to the seminary. I looked at Atlanta Interdenominational Seminary. I grew up on state campus where Benny Mays finished high school on that campus. So I had all of these things going on in my head, but I always heard you had to be called to the ministry.
Right.
And I kept listening. I never heard the call.
You didn't hear the call.
So I went over to tell my dad, and my dad said to me, well, son, he said, I suspect the world would much rather see a sermon than to hear one. And that defines what the church, what the black church really means in the black community. And so I wanted you to talk about your efforts in healthcare because I wanted you to share what it's like to stand in the pulpit looking at a congregation and
Sure.
that, as you said, 1 in 12 sitting out there has got diabetes, needs this help.
Yeah.
My late wife lost a 25-year battle to diabetes 2.5 years ago. 4 shots a day
Right.
of insulin.
Right.
And I saw what that cost was. $800 to $1,200 a month for a drug that's been around for 100 years.
100 years.
And they can make money if it's only $35 a month.
Yeah. Yeah.
That defines your ministry.
Yeah. No, it's the work that I've tried to do for a long time, long before I entered the Senate. And I do look at it through the lens of a pastor because I've been with families as they've wrestled with the kind of struggle that you describe and that you know very personally and intimately. It's the reason why I've been fighting since 2014 to get Georgia to expand Medicaid. Of course, South Carolina is another state that keeps refusing to expand Medicaid as politicians are playing a game focused on the battles of 10 years ago. And so, you know, I've gotten arrested in an act of civil disobedience, again, informed by that movement in the state capitol down in Georgia, fighting for Medicaid expansion. I came to the United States Capitol back in 2017.
Remember that day. Yeah.
Yeah, you and I talked that day. Later that day, I got arrested. Standing up, trying to fight for Medicaid expansion.
Absolutely.
They were cutting resources from the Children's Health Care Program.
Absolutely.
And I was here along with the Reverend Dr. William Barber and some others. And Barber told me it was my turn to get arrested that day.
Well, I'll tell you, it worked pretty good. You know, so, the first time I got arrested is when I met my wife. I was
wow. What a date.
Absolutely. But whatever it was, sometimes jail worked, I guess. We stayed married 58 years, and that was great. But I remember the day that you got arrested, and I remember what the issue was. We were all fighting for children. So that's Chip.
Yeah. And now my office is down the hall from the rotunda where I got arrested.
Absolutely.
And the Capitol Police, who were very kind and polite and professional that day, who were doing their job, had to take me to central booking that day. Nowadays, they help me when it's time for me to get to my office or get to the Capitol. And, you know, that's what I mean when I say a way out of nowhere.
Sure.
That the journey, the work that we're trying to do, the progress, it comes in fits and starts.
Yeah.
The democracy expands and it contracts. But America is a great nation because there always have been people who are willing to lay it all on the line for the country. You know, my dad was like that, and I talk about him a lot. And it's because he had such an amazing impact on me. He was a preacher, but not with the credentials that I've been able to gain because of his sacrifice for me. My dad, born in 1917, had an older father, and he served during the World War II era, all stateside, for about a year. And he used to talk about how he was on a bus and was asked to give up his seat while in his Army uniform to a white teenager. And he obliged, but he never forgot. But the thing that was remarkable about him is he would tell that story, but he never allowed anger or bitterness to overwhelm him. It deepened his resolve. He's a part of a generation that loved America until America learned how to love him back. And it is his patriotism, his dream of a country that would embrace his children that inspires me to this moment. My mother, much younger than my dad, grew up in Waycross, Georgia. Mm-hmm. And as I say sometimes, the 82-year-old hands that used to pick somebody else's cotton and tobacco picked her youngest son to be a United States Senator. That is the great and wonderfully complicated story, the family history of America. America, like all families, has a complicated history.
Absolutely.
Right?
And you know, really, you and I are going to have to talk even some more because you just said something about your dad. My father was 19 years older than my mother.
And mine was 21.
You know, and it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And my dad had the same kind of demeanor about him.
Yeah.
He with a lot of indignities that I saw him absolve so that I could be where I am today. I think about that a lot, and I'm sure you do, as well. One of the things I wanted to mention here, you mentioned your father in uniform when that incident occurred.
Yes.
A gentleman named Isaac Woodard, getting out of the military, being discharged in Georgia, coming home to South Carolina in uniform, and was dragged off a bus and his eyes punched out. He died a blind man. But because of that incident, Harry Truman was president of the United States and saw that, heard about it. It's what caused him to write that executive order that integrated the armed services. Armed services, a lot of people don't realize, the armed services was never integrated by the Congress.
Right.
It was the president signing an executive order that integrated the armed services.
Yeah.
The Congress came along later. But these kinds of incidents, Georgia, South Carolina, we got a whole lot more in common than we even know about to this day. But the other thing we got in common, John Lewis. He was my man.
Yeah, he was my John Lewis.
And you were his pastor.
Yeah.
Tell me how that was.
It was a real honor to serve John Lewis. As I said, I met him when I was a college student, and later when I became the pastor of Ebenezer Church, I became his pastor. And some of my earliest memories are serving not only him, but his wife, who was quite ill by the time I came to Ebenezer Church. So I did a number of pastoral visits with Lillian Lewis, who was a strong and indomitable spirit in her own right. And later, from time to time, would spend some time with him. And, as I was preparing to preside over his funeral, which happened while I was running for the Senate.
Oh, I remember. I was sitting there watching it.
I remember I asked myself as I was thinking about John Lewis, what was he thinking when he was crossing that Edmund Pettus Bridge with nothing but a backpack on, trench coat? I don't know, but here's what I do know. I know he was not thinking that at my death there would be 3 American presidents at his funeral on both sides of the aisle. Absolutely. Because we all respected John Lewis. He was not thinking that one day he would be the recipient of a Presidential Medal of Freedom. I think he was just trying to stay alive that day so he could fight the next day.
Absolutely.
And yet, by some stroke of destiny, mingled with courage and human determination, he built a bridge that became a bridge to the future. He bent the arc a little bit closer to justice. And so when I think about him in relationship to these difficult times that we're going through and the forces of division that are emerging and speak with a kind of full-throated, unembarrassed audacity, we can't afford to give up. Who am I to give up having known John Lewis?
Right.
He didn't have any reason to keep fighting, but he kept fighting the good fight, told us to stay into some good trouble. And that's the work I try to do even now as a legislator. I'm in the Congress, I'm in the Senate, but it is the spirit of the movement and a faith that has always centered justice and compassion and mercy and beloved community that guides my work.
I'm glad you mentioned Lillian, John's wife Lillian. John and I often talked about our wives, both professional librarians. Lillian and Emily were professional librarians, and they got to be great friends. And you and I were a part of the launching of their foundation in their honor several weeks ago. And I think it's just so fitting and proper for everybody to really remember. John Lewis was a little bit different from me anyway. You may have internalized a lot of what he did. We practice nonviolence. John internalized nonviolence. I don't know if I could ever become what John Lewis was, but watching him and having to lobby him for a vote, becoming his whip, and the whip's job is to get the 218 if you're on the House side, and you go to John. You kind of knew from the content of the legislation, well, not even talk to John about that, because certain things about him, he was really as close to a pacifist as anybody I've ever met. And so when it came to war and peace, John was always on the side of peace. I don't think he ever voted for but one defense bill the whole time I served with him, because there was always something there that he thought did not lead to peace. So it must have been a great experience to be his pastor.
It was.
But let me ask you a little bit about going forward. I've talked about the past. I often quote George Santayana, who said, if we fail to learn the lessons of the past, we're bound to repeat them. Do you think we've learned those past lessons sufficient enough for us to overcome the current divisions that we currently see in the country?
Well, I certainly hope so. But we have to remain vigilant, and we have to, I think, anchor ourselves in the story of folks who've always fought the good fight, and I think we have to be willing to stretch ourselves to create unlikely alliances in order to do good work. One of the things that we got done in this Congress was the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. I mention that because that may seem a little odd that I'd bring that up, but for me, infrastructure is about more than just bricks and mortar.
Absolutely.
It's more than roads and bridges. It's that, to be sure. It's more than broadband. It's really about the spirit of the country. It is about the recognition that there are some things and there are some spaces that we have to share. That's our shared house, the house we live in. And if you think about how broken the infrastructure of our country has been and for how long, in the wealthiest country on the planet, I think our broken infrastructure is a reflection of the brokenness of our politics. That there's a breakdown, a lack of attention to the covenant we have with one another as an American people, for our schools to be crumbling, for us not to have the high-speed rail and the kinds of things that we ought to be embracing. And so I think, and I've seen this as a pastor, that sometimes when a family is struggling and you're having conflict in your family, and all families do, you can't always solve the problem. You can sit here and argue about this issue or that issue forever. Or sometimes the best thing you can do while you're working through those issues, rather than working on each other, find something to work on together.
Yeah.
To dream, to build. And while you're building and working and perfecting the space that you share together, I think that at least provides a context to work through some of these fault lines of division that certain folks are trying to stir up right now. And so when we passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, a strange thing happened that I never would have predicted. It's called the Cruz-Warnock Amendment. Ted Cruz, that is. Mm-hmm. Ted Cruz and I disagree on many, many things, to be sure. But he and I both are on the Commerce Committee of the Senate. And as it turns out, he had something that he wanted to get done that I also wanted to get done. And the night we passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, we had to do it as an amendment, couldn't do it in committee. And he stood up and made his argument for why he thought this should happen. And then I stood up and made my argument, and I heard myself say words that I'd never thought I'd hear myself say, something along the order of, I agree with the senator from Texas.
Yeah.
And the chamber burst out in laughter, all of our colleagues, and they passed it overwhelmingly.
Sure.
And Twitter began to fire up. And folks on my side, and I suspect on his side, my staff was showing me what was going on Twitter. Folks were asking, well, what is this? What is this Cruz-Warnock amendment? How could you stand with him? It's very, very simple. I-14, an interstate he wants to see built out in Texas, wants to see it named a priority corridor so we could get the resources to build it out. That interstate that runs through Texas also runs through Georgia.
Absolutely.
It connects blue and red communities, chocolate cities and vanilla suburbs. It transcends race, class, all of the things that we think divide us. And if we can get that highway built out, all kinds of folks can get on the highway to get to where they need to go.
Absolutely. When you think about that, the interstate I-95,
yeah,
Maine to Miami.
Yeah.
How many states does it cross?
Yeah.
Bringing all these communities together. When you start talking about the I-95 corridor, it's defined by what state you're in. Yeah. And so it's kind of interesting to talk about.
Yeah, and in a larger sense, my point is that there's a highway that runs through our humanity.
Well,
that's larger than race. That's larger than
it's right in our motto.
Politics.
You mentioned it earlier. E pluribus unum.
Yeah.
Other men in one. How do you do that? Yeah. That's how you do it.
Yeah.
Getting people together. It's an infrastructure that we don't usually think about, but it's really there. I want you to share with us a little bit this book, the title. I often think one of my favorite scriptures is Hebrew 11:1. Faith, substance of things hoped for,
right? The
evidence of things not seen. Now, you and I are operating on a lot of faith these days. Because some things that we are hoping for that we don't see yet. You're over in the Senate, and a lot of us will rely upon what happens in the Senate. Tell me a little bit about your hope for some of us that we still have not seen evidence of.
Well, we've gotten some things done this Congress, and I think it's important to point that out. We passed the American Rescue Plan, which helped us to get this virus under control so we could reopen the economy. We supported municipal government, cities, and states so they didn't have to lay off municipal workers and firefighters and police officers. That bill provided resources so our schools could reopen safely and be retrofitted in response to the pandemic. We helped farmers, and in that bill, we passed the single largest tax cut for middle and working class families in American history. I had hoped we would extend it, the expanded child tax credit, but we did pass it. And we went on from there, passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And now we're working on the jobs and competition bill, which would help ensure that America remains competitive and continues to lead well into the 21st century. And we need all of our talent in order to do that. So it invests in high-tech hubs and in colleges and universities and research and development. But in spite of all of that, people are in pain.
There are.
They're
and
struggling.
People are looking to us, but the glass half full requires that we focus sometimes on the things to do to continue filling up the glass.
Yeah.
If you stay so preoccupied with that part of the glass that's is still empty, we'll lose the ability, the energy, and everything else that's required to continue filling it up.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad you mentioned those things that we passed. You did not mention the omnibus appropriation bill.
Yeah.
That was huge.
Yeah.
One of the earliest times I've seen that happen since I've been here, and a very good time. And we're still working.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, or alluded to, the compete side.
Yeah. So what keeps me up at night right now is I'm thinking about the pressures that ordinary families are feeling. They go to the gas pump, they see record prices, but oil and gas companies are experiencing record profits. So we've got to deal with this price gouging, the ways in which also Putin's wars certainly not helping with pressures around that. So, one of the things that I'd like to see us do is pass a federal gas tax suspension as we make our way through these difficult times. I'd like to see us cap the cost of prescription drugs, get the bill across the finish line on the Senate side to get the cost of insulin capped, and continue to invest in the future for all of our children.
Well, we just passed, I don't know when this is going to be seen by the public, but today, as you are taping this program, just about 2 hours ago, the House passed a pretty significant piece of legislation that will lower the cost of fuel and food.
Right.
We're going to send it over to the Senate.
They say it's the cooling bowl, but sometimes it's the place where things can unfortunately die. But I'm going to be doing everything I can and centering the concerns of ordinary people.
But I think you just mentioned something that I think the public, there's a lot about inflation. This inflation is worldwide.
That's right.
It's $5 a gallon in some places here. It's over $6 and $8 in some other countries. This is a worldwide inflationary spiral that the entire world is working to get under control. But there are some things that we do have control over, and that is whether or not we will allow the price gouging that's taking place to continue to flourish.
Right.
And so much of this cost that the public is suffering through got nothing to do with this administration or any or the Congress.
Yeah.
It's got a lot to do with whether or not everybody in the private as well as the public sector will step up and do what's necessary to bring things under control. And I'm glad you mentioned that. But we came here to talk about your book. We've gotten away from it, but a way out of nowhere.
That's what all this is about.
Absolutely.
This has been my life's work.
Absolutely.
And your life's work.
Absolutely.
And I'm deeply honored to be able to do it on behalf of the people of Georgia.
Well, let's talk about a little bit going forward. I think that you are so much of what the future of this great country is all about. You are in a pretty spirited campaign for full term. You're filling out a term, which means you got to work for. You're running out for the full term, and I know a little bit about what that's like, and I won't get into any kind of partisan politics here, but I think that what is important to share with people exactly a little bit more about you today. We know from whence you come, but what's your vision for Georgia's future, your vision for this country's future and the world?
Yeah, when you see me, you see someone who knows personally the difference that good federal public policy makes. As I said, I'm an alum of Head Start, Upward Bound, low-interest student loans. I'd like to see, and I've been pushing to get the president to do meaningful student debt cancellation. I was on a plane the other day, actually during the holidays, coming back to Georgia, and there was a young couple a few rows ahead of me, and they had their young son with them, looked like he was about a year old or so. And they waited for me as we were getting off the plane. First, they asked for my autograph, which is still a strange thing to me. I don't think about myself in those terms. Mm-hmm. And then the mother handed me an airline ticket, and she had written a note on it. And she said, "We're big supporters of yours. We're glad you won, and I only have one ask." She said, "Could you please do something about student debt?" She went on to say in that little note that I kept, and every now and then I look at it, she said that she borrowed $35,000 trying to getting through college to make her life better. And borrowed $35,000. She's a college graduate. She has paid back $20,000 of the $35,000, and she still owes $30,000. She said, "I feel like I'm in a government-sanctioned loan debt or debt trap." So, a lot has happened since, even in the 30-some years since I graduated from college. Too many of our young people now have a mortgage before they even get a mortgage.
Mm-hmm.
Student loan debt has surpassed credit card debt in our country. It has surpassed automobile loans in our country. That has huge implications. When young people in their 20s and 30s and 40s are weighed down with that kind of debt, it makes it very difficult to buy a home. You're not very likely to start a business because you've got this, you're shackled by this thing. So we've got to get control over the cost of college, which has outpaced inflation significantly for a long time now. And we've got to deal with the fact that over the last 30 years or so, state governments have shifted this burden of getting a college education to families, and they're borrowing this money. And so there are larger structural issues that need to be addressed, to be sure. But in the meantime, I'd love to see if the president give people some relief, do some student debt cancellation. He's been good on this in terms of the pause that was put on payment.
On payment, yeah.
But I'd like to see us do that. I'd like to see us cap the cost of prescription drugs, cap the cost of insulin, and I'd like to see us invest in the future, which is what this jobs and competition bill that we're working on right now is all about.
And that's another thing I want us to begin thinking about, and I'll just raise it here today because of the history of it. I'm surprised at the number of people who don't realize this. I think that what's really, really important going forward is this thing we call Social Security.
Yeah.
Already, I saw, let's just say, a member of the Senate now putting forth the notion that Social Security ought to maybe sunsetted after 5 years. What is that about?
Yeah.
I think few people realize that when Social Security first came online back in 1935, it did not cover people who worked on farm workers. It did not cover domestic workers. And 65% of black people in this country are in those two fields of employment. So Social Security didn't even apply to them. Now, over time, we've brought all these people under Social Security. Now you hear and talk about maybe Social Security is not a good thing. I'm sure that is something we need to start a discussion about. What do we need to do to show up and make Social Security a thing that would be guaranteed for the future of our children, our grandchildren? Because a lot of people work in jobs that will not allow them to have 501, whatever we call it, not 501, whatever we call these things that I don't know a whole lot about. I'm not a stock market person. I just kind of look for my Social Security and other retirement to take care of me. But Social Security, I think, has got to be a big thing we got to start thinking about.
Yeah, well, we have to honor our mother and our father.
Absolutely.
The scripture says so that our days will be long upon the earth. And we've got to protect our seniors. And we also have to honor the pact that we have with our veterans.
Absolutely.
Georgia's a big veteran state. 1 in 10 people in our state is attached in some way to the military. And we have seen a new generation of veterans, post-9/11 veterans, who have been exposed, who've had toxic exposure in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in other places, and they've had a hard time getting the benefits that they need as a result of their service. So they literally go abroad, fight for us, and then come back home and have to fight with us to get the health benefits that they deserve. So I'm glad that we have now moved forward with honoring our pact across the finish line, and that's going to make a huge difference for about 3.5 million veterans.
Absolutely. We owe it to the veterans. We owe it to our seniors. People living in their golden years ought to be free of some of the anxieties that they're currently carrying. And I do know that it may be important for us to stay focused on making a way out of no way, but sometimes you got to have time for that. And a lot of our elders don't have the time that you and I have. Well, maybe I don't have the time that you got.
You're looking pretty good, sir.
I feel okay, but the fact remains, I know that there's so much that needs to be done. And once again, I think the scripture says, we call the elderly because...
Old man, I call you. A young man, I call you because you're strong. The old, I call you because you know the way.
You know the way.
Yeah.
And so there's got to be this kind of a balance, I think, going forward. Those who know the way have got to be able to rely upon those of you who are much stronger, and those of you who are so strong should benefit from those who may know the way. But all that is what this book is all about. All that is what living your faith is all about. I say all the time, faith means so much. Not just in the black church, but it means so much in the American way. That's what the democracy is all about.
Right.
Having faith in each other, depending upon each other to keep this country strong, leaving it better than what we found it. These things are so important. And they aren't just slogans. They are what we should be doing for our children and our grandchildren. If I were to ask you to just tell us in political terms, now I know what the future holds. What would you advise young people today about the future? Some of whom are wondering whether there is going to be anything for them to come along. What would you say to a youngster growing up in public housing, dreaming about whether or not they will be able to go off to higher education? And I say that because I go beyond college. I think it's very important for electricians and plumbers and everybody else.
Vocational and community colleges.
Absolutely. What would you say to a young person?
There was a great graduate of Morehouse College named Howard Thurman, a great thinker.
Absolutely.
And Howard Thurman said, ask not what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. And so I would encourage a young person who has seen your story, heard my story, to connect to that thing that gives you passion and the thing you would do even if you weren't paid, except that you got to make a living. But that thing that captures your imagination, if you can connect with that and then prepare yourself and perfect your craft, whatever that is, you'll find a place and you'll find people who will help you along the way. I've been incredibly blessed. I grew up in a family where we were short on money, but long on faith, long on hope, and a lot of laughter in my family.
That's great.
I think part of this journey is not taking yourself too seriously, even though we're living through serious times. And it has served me well, and I'm deeply honored to represent the people of Georgia in the United States Senate. It's difficult, but one of the scriptures that continues to inform my journey is the Gospel of John, where it says, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness overcometh it not. The times are difficult, but there is a way to penetrate the darkness. And I would hope that each of us in our own way would try to be that light.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned two things. Number one, finding something to do for which you're not paid. I have 3 grown daughters, and I've said to them over and over again, I don't care what jobs you get, you're supposed to earn your pay, but I want you to find something to do for which you're not paid. And that's where the rewards come. One of them, of course, went down to Georgia during the campaign, your campaign, and worked.
I'm grateful.
She feels so good about that. That she just feels that, but for that time she spent on your campaign, you might not have gotten elected. But that's what it's all about. But I want to thank you for that. But the other thing is this: never give up.
That's right.
I lost 3 times before I got elected. And a friend of mine said to me, "What you going to do now? You know what they say: 3 strikes and you're out." And I said, "That's a baseball rule. Nobody should live their lives by baseball rules." So I would say to young people today, just remember, no matter how many times you try, the next time just may be the time. So never give up this fight. And thank you.
Thank you.
For not allowing the life that you started with be a burden but an incentive to put you where you are today. Because I'm convinced that we are guided by our experiences. And those experiences that you've had, growing up in public housing, struggling to get through college, and going on to get a terminal degree, and now sit in one of the most famous pulpits in America, and serving under the great dome of these United States of America as a United States Senator, the first, and this is the first time I've said this, African American to represent the state of Georgia in the United States Senate ever. All of that is because you kept the faith.
A way out of no way.
Absolutely. You made a way out of no way. Thank you for that.
Thank you.